BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Tom Sutcliffe and this is Start the Week from BBC Radio 4. Hope you enjoy the programme. This sound has been part of the human experience for as long as there have been humans. The dawn chorus, which almost certainly started the day for our primate ancestors too. And over the millennia, what we think and feel about that sound has both stayed the same and changed immeasurably as our relationship to the natural world shifted between worship and exploitation, between superstition and scientific analysis. That's our subject today, and with me to talk about it are the ornithologist Tim Birkhead, whose book Birds and Us offers a history of our changing attitudes to these hugely varied animals. The anthropologist Alison Richard has spent much of her life studying on the island of Madagascar, a unique island ecology which has much to tell us about how environments thrive and fail. And Mark Glancy of the Museum of Scotland joins us too to talk about their exhibition of the work of a great naturalist illustrator, John James Audubon, as canny at business and self-promotion as he was at painting birds. Tim Birkhead, you only mention Audubon once in your book, and you use the word infamous about him, with a question mark, I should say. He does mark one of the great shifts, the hinge points in this history, doesn't he? From a fascination with birds that has no compunction about killing them to a fascination which is all about conservation.
Oh yes, Audubon was controversial in as much that he shot birds in order to be able to paint them, and he paints them very beautifully. But today we would look upon that with considerable concern, I think. Yeah,
we find it kind of almost inconceivable that somebody who cared about birds so much would be indifferent to killing so many of them, and yet that's quite a modern feeling.
But it's also quite common throughout history of the study of birds, that contradiction. You know, people love birds, but they don't mind killing them or dissecting them or whatever.
Take us back to the beginning, because the subtitle of your book is a 12,000-year history. So where do you start and why there?
I actually start in a cave, El Taco de la Figuras, in southern Spain, in Andalusia. And I've been going to Spain for 35 years, and it was only 2 or 3 years ago that I discovered that within an hour's drive of where we regularly stay, there is this cave with more paintings of birds than all other caves put together. And birds don't generally feature in cave art very much at all. And so to find a cave, and it's tiny, you can almost touch both sides with outstretched hands, over 200 images of birds was literally mind-blowing for me. And I was incredibly privileged to be taken there by somebody from the University of Cadiz and shown the birds, very up close. And it was overwhelming. It was just the most remarkable experience for me. And I kind of had this sense, this is where ornithology began.
Well, I was going to say, was that your feeling, that you had a connection with the people who painted them, that you thought we are essentially the same, that we're looking at these birds in the same way, at least some level?
Absolutely. And one of the most remarkable things about those paintings is that even though they're done with tremendous simplicity, they're done with such accuracy that many of them can be identified down to the species. I mean, it's just remarkable. These people knew birds absolutely intimately. And my overall feeling is that this cave probably served as a kind of tutorial to young hunters. The cave is positioned near the Straits of Gibraltar, which is just a conduit for vast numbers of birds coming through.
When was this cave? When were these paintings made?
About 8,000 years ago.
About 8,000 years ago. And so it is essentially a catalogue, in part.
It's a field guide.
A field guide. But what do you feel about the ideas, which is very common with cave paintings, that they have some magical sort of purpose as well, that they're there as a charm or an enchantment or a way of kind of channeling the spirit of the bird?
The ideas relating to the interpretation of cave art have changed over the years dramatically. And as a scientist, I'm afraid I feel that those views are rather unscientific. And some people have said, well, it's not even worth trying to interpret those cave paintings, but you can't help it. Kind of, what does it mean? And that's why I ended up thinking, well, maybe this was a kind of tutorial to young hunters. Come into the cave and I'll show you what's going to appear as the migrants arrive.
And to a certain degree, a recognition guide as well.
Absolutely.
Now, you talk of it as a field guide. Does it represent birds that are no longer common to that area? Does it record, as it were, a change in?
It does. One of the most frequent images in the cave is the great bustard. And this must have been the ultimate prize if you were a hunter. You know, it's like the size of a turkey. There's a lot of meat on a great bustard. And they no longer exist in that region of Spain. They've gone extinct. So it does provide a little bit of history for us in that sense.
You move on to ancient Egypt in your next chapter, and a truly astounding statistic to me. The discovery of 4 million ibis mummies in Egyptian catacombs. I mean, is there any knowledge of why they were mummified?
Yeah, it's all a bit vague. Worship, you know, there was something. I mean, the bird is called the Sacred Ibis. It was a godlike bird, but we really have no idea why all this happened. And if it hadn't been for COVID, I would have gone. I'd love to have scrambled through those catacombs to see, you know, they're still there in their clay pots. Sadly, I wasn't able to do that. But the interesting question that's arisen from that, 4 million birds, where did they all come from? And there's been a lot of speculation. People have suggested that maybe ibises were domesticated. And one of the interesting things is that there's a difference between captive breeding and domestication. The two aren't the same. And in the literature, those two have become a little bit muddled.
What is the difference between?
Well, you can bring wild birds into captivity and have them breed, but they're not domesticated. Usually domesticated animals have been through some kind of genetic bottleneck which reduces some of the variation, but also captures features like plumage aberrations and so on. So the reason you get blue budgerigars instead of green ones is largely because of domestication and selective breeding. And so the consensus is that they probably weren't domesticated, but they must have been captive bred or captive reared, in the sense that people went out into the marshes, found clutches of eggs, and possibly incubated them artificially.
That was the remarkable thing, that they may have had a sort of incubation system. Clearly there was an industrial process going on, not just to acquire 4 million ibises, but to mummify them.
Two processes going on. Artificially incubating them, the Egyptians were clearly expert at this, and it took a long, long time for anybody else to be able to recreate that. It's actually very sophisticated. You think it's just a bird warming its egg. There's lots of other things going on as well. And then the mummification process, I suspect, was a lot simpler. Embalming, dipping the things in kind of resin and so on, and then wrapping them up. Sometimes the sarcophagi that they're in are very sophisticated, but you're right. Two industries side by side.
Now, we like to think we've moved on from that notion of the bird as a sacred object. I mean, I'm sure there are remnants of it in various of our attitudes to birds. But how early does what you might reasonably call ornithological rigour appear in the historical record? When do we start to get the first attempt to really scientifically work out what's happening with birds?
Okay, it is during the scientific revolution in the 1650s, and the two key players there are John Ray and Francis Willoughby, two colleagues. Like chalk and cheese, they were very different, but the most fantastic working team partnership. And they systematically decided they were going to categorise all the known birds in Britain and Europe, and travelled around the country and across Europe, collecting birds, another example of shooting birds, in order to study them. But they had a standard methodology of describing the birds, and that was really the beginning of a kind of scientific method.
And what sort of classification were they using? It's pre-Linnaean, isn't it, there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classification that actually had its roots in Aristotle's thinking in ancient Greece. I mean, their primary division is between water birds and land birds, which is pretty obvious. And then they subsequently go on to finer and finer divisions based on the shape of the beak and the shape of the feet and so on. But the crucial thing was that they were systematic in the way they did this.
What's interesting to a non-birder like me is that it appears to be both systematic and arbitrary. I mean, I can blushingly confess I have seen the word passerine numerous times in my life, and only this week did I look it up. and work out that it means a perching bird,
Yes.
a bird in which the toes are arranged such that they can perch on a bird. That does, even now, feel to me a little arbitrary as a way of dividing birds into groups.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there is a huge sense of arbitrariness in this. And in fact, the business of classifying birds now using molecular techniques is something that's still ongoing. And there are still unresolved areas. There are some groups of birds that have evolved so rapidly that there isn't enough molecular distinction between them to really figure out what's going on. So it's been a primary objective of ornithologists for well over 1,000 years.
But in the meantime, we have these systems which allow us to kind of cope with chaos, as it were, and find some order within it.
It's a bit like the definition of a species. It's a kind of working hypothesis. If we don't have any kind of definition, we can't make any progress. So let's just say it's this, and then we'll move forward.
Can you tell us, before we move on, can you tell us a little about natural theology and the part it played in our changing attitudes? Because there was a moment at which, as it were, the prodigious variety of birds was an example of God's work in the world.
John Ray was the prime mover in this and came up with this idea of natural theology as a way of combining religious and scientific beliefs. And his idea was that God had created everything, but he'd done it in a very clever way. And what Ray did was to focus on adaptations like the swan's long neck and its webbed feet. God had done this in his wisdom to create a bird that could feed on submerged aquatic vegetation and swim at the same time. And everybody seemed to think, that's a pretty cool idea. Yes, we'll go along with that. And for a long time, natural theology seemed like the best explanation of the natural world. But John Ray was actually more of a scientist than he was an ordained priest, because during his lifetime, spermatozoa were discovered. And Leeuwenhoek, who discovered them, said, even though there are millions of sperm in a single ejaculate, only one is probably necessary to cause fertilization. And John Ray said, well, that doesn't sound like a very all-wise God. Why does he produce all these wasted sperm? And if John Ray had been a kind of classical religious person, he'd have come up with some story to explain that away. But he doesn't. He says, I can't explain it. I shall leave it to future generations.
They had other problems too. The cuckoo was a particular problem for natural theology, wasn't it?
The cuckoo was a problem for a long time. Why would God make a bird whose tiny, recently hatched chick hoiked out of the nest the host's eggs and chicks? And a lot of ornithologists who were Christian believers just ignored that. They really couldn't cope with it. Yet, when Darwin came along in the 1850s and 60s, he laid out what he thought the cuckoo was doing in terms of natural selection. And subsequently, ornithologists have looked at Darwin's ideas and tested them, and Darwin was absolutely right.
And when do we arrive first at the modern notion of conservation, of the idea that the central interest in looking at birds is to preserve their lives?
That starts in about 1860 with probably one of the greatest Victorian ornithologists, Alfred Newton, professor of zoology at Cambridge. And he was interested in the great auk and had been on an expedition to Iceland to see if he could find any survivors. It went extinct in 1844. And he couldn't, obviously, because it was extinct. But it's made him start thinking about the conservation of species. It made him think about extinction in a different way. Up until this point, extinction was a natural process. Something goes extinct because it wasn't well adapted to its environment and is replaced by something else. Man comes along and causes extinction, and there's nothing to replace it. And Newton really latched onto this. At the same time as he was doing this, on the Flamborough headland on the east coast of Yorkshire, people are taking trains to go to the coast and hire a boat and go and shoot seabirds in huge numbers.
This is at Bempton Cliffs.
Bempton Cliffs,
yes.
And Newton was appalled by this pointless slaughter. And this really was the beginning of the conservation movement. And there was an act of Parliament to stop shooting at Bempton.
It is extraordinary. I mean, as I say, I'm not a birder, but to visit Bempton Cliffs is a remarkable. I would urge anybody to do it because it will convert you to birds, I think, almost.
Me too.
But the idea of taking a day trip simply to hippopotamus, not for food, not for any utility. I mean, I think they did feed into the millinery trade, didn't they?
The kittiwakes did, yes, but it was mainly just for fun. But in that respect, it's no different from shooting pheasants or grouse today.
Mark Lansey, I wanted to bring you in because one of the wonderful pictures in the exhibition at the Museum of Scotland, the Audubon pictures, is a picture of Carolina parakeets, I think it is. A brilliantly vivid image of a profusion of birds on a food crop. And there's a story of kind of extinction behind that as well, isn't there?
There is, yeah. Audubon had this magnificent illustration of 7 Carolina parakeets feeding on cockleburs. But he, in his writings, which was a sort of separate publication from the Birds of America, a sort of complementary publication called Ornithological Biography, he then wrote about his descriptions of birds. And with the Carolina parakeet, he was already saying that the numbers were decreasing. So in the 1830s, he was saying that there was roughly half the number that he had seen in the Mississippi 15 years before. So he was pointing out, he was in no way a conservationist the way we would associate it, but what he did was start to raise awareness in his writings of deforestation and Carolina parakeet. And in Labrador, it was the eggers, sort of commercial egg harvesters who would go and smash all the eggs in a nest to encourage the birds to lay fresh eggs and then take those to market. And we're talking about 400,000 eggs in a matter of months.
It is extraordinary. Alison, Richard, there is a bit of this story in Madagascar too, isn't it? A sense of profusion just within historical reach, but then mass extinctions.
Yes, but the hope that I take is that people who've been in Madagascar, they settled Madagascar, all the human footprints were there from about 10,000 years ago. But you don't start to see a decline in the great animals of Madagascar until a little over 1,000 years ago. So for the best part of 9,000 years, people and wildlife lived there together. And so from that I conclude it's not the fact of people that is a disaster, it's what you do.
And there may be some kind of tipping point.
There's a tipping point. But even then, it's not simple. I mean, there is a story about Madagascar that people arrived and they burned the forest down and they slaughtered all the animals. Well, as I say, for 9,000 years, there's no evidence of that at all. And then you take the great elephant birds, right, that disappeared probably by the 16th century. There is a grand total of 6 individual elephant birds with bones with cut marks made by a butcher's knife. There are no remains of these birds in early human settlements. So kind of this notion that there was some extended giant banquet going on after people arrived there just doesn't add up. Now, there's eggshell, to be sure, and maybe people were harvesting eggs, and one giant elephant bird's egg takes somewhere between 150 and 180 chicken eggs. So it's a hell of an omelette.
An elephant bird, we should say, is something like 3 to 4 metres high.
The biggest, there are 7 species. The biggest was 3 to 4 metres high. The family to which they belong are incredibly fierce. Then cassowaries will disembowel people today at the drop of a hat. So, sort of one also says, they would, with just a spear, these would have been pretty fierce critters to go hunting for meat.
Yeah. Something made them disappear, but we'll come back to that because
I have a question about this.
Well, go on, quickly ask your question.
Can I ask my?
Yeah.
So maybe they were too fierce to be a very good meal. However, there's a 13th century Arabic report that a sultan in Arabia wanted plumes of these elephant birds from Madagascar, and he sent a messenger to bring them back. Now, my question to you, and they would have had magnificent tail feathers, and that would be maybe worth going after them for and risking these dangerous animals. My question to you is, have you encountered any elephant bird plumes in your travels in Europe?
Not at all. And I'm interested in hearing you say that they had these plumes. I mean, what's the evidence that they had plumes? I mean, ostriches do, but some of the other large ratites have very boring plumage.
Ratites are these giant
Flyers
cassowary.
birds.
Yeah.
There speaks an ornithologist. I'm just a primate person.
I tell you
who
one
likes
thing.
plumes.
One thing we know.
I assumed that they did, Tim.
We don't know. I mean, the fact that I've never come across any reference to it suggests that maybe they didn't.
We do know about the elephant bird that Audubon would not have been able to fit it onto one of his illustrations, because it was one of his principles, wasn't it, that he drew birds life size, which caused him some problems. He used this giant paper,
Yes,
elephant folio,
double elephant folio.
double elephant folio,
at least a metre tall, and that was the one thing, I suppose, that made Audubon different from his predecessors and often his contemporaries as well, is that every bird had to be depicted life size. Now, that did mean that there was an element of contortion, even for the very large birds, to fit them in. We have a golden eagle with a white hair flying off in something that is aerodynamically impossible.
Yes, the wings have all been bent into the plate, haven't they?
And it's flying up almost like a rocket vertically. And obviously there's a famous flamingo as well with the bent neck as well. So he did have difficulty. He also liked, even in that large paper, he thought the small birds worked very well in the centre, and he thought that would ensure the success.
Your exhibition opens with this very famous image of Audubon by John Syme, a painting of him. It now hangs in the White House, I think.
That's correct.
It brings together a number of strands of his identity. Can you just describe it for us?
Yeah, he was portrayed in that portrait as the American woodsman, a frontiersman. Bear in mind, this was only a few months after Last of the Mohicans had been published in Britain, so there was this fascination. And he did play up to it. He would make quite a striking figure, wandering about with his long hair oiled in bear grease and his woolskin coat. And that's how he was portrayed with his fowling piece.
His fowling piece, which was a tool of art, as well as part of the costume of the backwoodsman, because he did shoot a lot of birds, didn't he, in order to draw them?
He shot more birds than he would probably need for both his art, his research, and also just for food as well. He would, for the Carolina parakeets, which are now extinct, he had a basket full, so he would pick the best specimens and pin those onto what he called a position board, in a pose that he had seen, or whatever he was trying to portray, held it with pins on a gridded board, and then painted from that.
And was that his innovation in ornithological illustration then, that he was working both from field studies and field observations of colour and so on, but then also working from the preserved body of the bird, fixed in a sort of taxidermied position almost?
Yes, but he was almost painting on the spot for those. When he talks about the caracara eagle, he mentions that the plumage is changing colour rapidly in the high temperatures.
Do you mean after death?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he would shoot with a mustard shot, so it would kill the bird but less damage to the plumage, and then paint pretty much immediately in that. Later on, of course, he was in Britain and was using museum specimens for reference. Now,
I mean, his great work is The Birds of America. He does a lot of his work. So why the Scottish connection?
The Scottish connection is very fortuitous. He was unable to find an engraver in Philadelphia in 1824 and realised he'd have to go to Europe, and that basically meant London or Paris. But he thought, I'm going to go to Edinburgh for a short visit because I desperately want to meet Walter Scott. He did eventually. He was there for 5 months, but who he did meet was William Home Lazars, who offered to engrave his watercolour models. And so that's where the Birds of America, as we say, takes flight. Unfortunately, Lazar's colours went on strike after only 10 had been printed, so he did end up in London with the Havel family.
And how did he? I was very curious about that. I mean, he's producing this book on a subscription model. It's enormously expensive, isn't it? It's I don't know what the current cost would be, or a modern equivalent would be. But you have to be very rich to order this book.
It was basically created as a rare book at 2 guineas a set, which was a set of 5. And funnily enough, he didn't work on classification, unlike other bird books. He had 1 large, 1 medium, and 3 small birds to each set. I think that was very canny because he realised if he had all the large birds, then people would stop subscribing. So it was really...
So it was a sort of part work, as part works are sold now. You make sure that they have to keep coming back.
But it was really only wealthy patrons and institutions that could have really stay the course for 11 years. So our unbound prints are either from lap subscription or from further sets that have been broken up and sold as individual prints.
And how did he control the colour production, for example? He has to send it away. He's obviously very concerned to get it right.
He didn't send it away. He basically supervised at Havel's. And when he was in America painting birds, his son Victor acted as his agent and supervisor, and they were quite demanding, I think, as well. So what would happen is they would run one printer's proof, a proof copy, which he would then annotate for the colours and just explain why that's a deeper blue or that's a slightly dark, and then they would work from that.
He also cannily managed to sidestep. There was a law that said you had to provide a free copy of your book to at least 11 copyright libraries. He had a rather ingenious way of getting round that, didn't he?
He was a failed businessman and bankrupt, but when it came to the Birds of America, he was quite canny entrepreneur. He realised that if the book itself had text, it would be eligible for potentially 11 libraries asking for a free copy under the Copyright Act. So there is no text in the Birds of America other than the legend on the plates. He was even worried that once he got to 100 and you could get it as a bound volume, whether a title page would actually fall then into that category of having to give a copyright copy. So
by leaving the text off, he didn't have to give away those 11 very expensive copies. He didn't end up by making a lot of money out of it, did he?
No. He reckoned 300 subscribers would set him up. They reckon there's somewhere around 200 and only maybe 175 full sets. So he didn't make the money on the Birds of America that he thought would support his family.
How reliable is he as a naturalist, do you think? There is a story, he tells the story of having been one of the first people to ring birds in order to observe their behaviour. There is some dispute about this, apparently. But...
there is, and partly it's because Audubon was a bit loose with dates in particular. So the date that he said he was ringing these birds with a little bit of silver thread, he probably was in France at the time, but there is a high probability he did the ringing but just got the dates wrong because he was constantly getting names wrong and dates.
Tim, when you look at an Audubon plate, do you see everything that's wrong in it, or do you?
No, I love them. And the thing I really admire, well, 2 things I admire. He had a fantastic sense of design, even though those birds were scrunched up onto the page. The golden eagle can't do that. It's still a fantastic design. The other thing is that Audubon was a fantastic sense of how a bird should be. As an ornithologist, if you look at pictures of paintings of puffins, most ornithologists really get them badly wrong. They just cannot deal with the beak. Audubon gets it completely right. I mean, he knew his birds, he knew their kind of postures, he knew their jizz, as we say in birdwatching terminology.
Just explain that. What was the word you just used?
Jizz is just, it is an acronym, I can't remember the details, but it encompasses everything about that bird's being.
The geist of the bird, the spirit of the bird.
Yeah, absolutely. And Audubon had that because he was a close observer. So he was a skilled artist and a good observer. But you're right, he makes factual mistakes. Just before this, I looked at his account of the guillemot, and there's a lot of errors in there, which is kind of understandable at that stage of our understanding of birds.
Does he begin to affect a shift in attitude to birds, do you think, or is he just happens to be there at that moment?
I don't think he does at the time, but I think his writings then spur people onto sort of, I'd call him a nascent conservationist. He realised the impact that humans were having on the environment, or the potential impact with deforestation, the spread of agriculture. So the natural habitat was disappearing, and he thought that would be the factor that reduced bird populations rather than overhunting. But in the case of the passenger pigeon, it was a bit of both.
Alison.
I reading what your book, Tim, it's really interesting and sort of moving to hear your very early passion for birds and how that developed. And I was just wondering, Audubon had an extraordinary passion for a lifetime. Where did that come from? What were the seeds of his interest in birds and painting?
When he was in France as a young child, that was at the time of the terror. So I think academically he wasn't. He didn't attend schooling a lot. I think he just spent all his time out studying nature. And his room as a boy was full of nests and eggs that he'd collected. So it was a very early fascination. And he tried, wherever possible, to draw, but I think it was only when he came up with the idea of the position board that he felt he was actually capturing the birds. Before then, it was very much copying other illustrators he'd seen, but it's a lifelong passion for him.
He was born in Haiti, wasn't he?
That's correct.
And did he? When did he leave Haiti? Was he old enough there to have seen the birds of Haiti as well?
No, he was quite. He probably did, but he was quite young. And that information came out after he had died. He actually told when we see his record of, say, elections to societies, it's always Audubon of Louisiana. The French, but the Haiti part is never really covered until later when people were digging into his roots.
Alison, Richard, I want to turn to Madagascar now. And you were hinting earlier when we were talking briefly that it's often presented as an environmental cautionary tale, and your book sets out to question that, essentially, and say it's too simplistic. Before we get to the correction, can you just tell us again what the simplistic version is?
Well, the simplistic version is that Madagascar was a timeless forested paradise until the Malagasy people arrived and cut it all down and burned down the forest, cut down the forest, and slaughtered all the animals. Now, it's not to say that there aren't huge environmental challenges facing Madagascar as the world. However, that is a simplistic story that was in fact created in the early 20th century by European colonists who had every reason to want to say that the natives were not to be trusted so that they could exploit them themselves. The story has stuck because the story of Paradise Lost is a deep and pervasive story for all of Western society.
Now, there must be some degree of truth to it because human settlement has an effect. How do you go about teasing out the genuine effects of human settlement and then the natural patterns of an island ecology, which is very different?
The answer is a lot of research, a lot of science, and looking at patterns of loss of animal species, looking at ancient types of vegetation, and coming back to our feathered friends, because I think that the giant elephant birds are a very good case in point. It wasn't a single slaughter. It was a synergy of effects, local climate changes that would have made a habitat sort of unlivable, a little hunting, probably, well, certainly we know from these few butchered bones that there was some hunting, egg collecting. So over a period of several centuries, it seems that these animals would have slowly disappeared, but they lived at low density. And at some point, it becomes difficult to find mates. And so, maybe as an adult, you would say, well, as a child, I remember there being more. But it happens slowly enough for people not to notice in their lifetime. So it tells a different story from a wantonly destructive people. And I think that's a much better, as we look to the future, it is a much better basis to imagine creating the kinds of partnership and the kinds of activity that will give not just Madagascar is a microcosm for the world, but to give us all a sense that despair is not an option and not required either.
You say Madagascar is a microcosm. It is also a unique ecology, like a lot of island ecologies. What is particularly special about Madagascar? It's not just its isolation, is it?
Well, I mean, heads it's an island, tails it's a continent. It's the fourth biggest island in the world, and it has a huge variety of relief. It has rainforest in the east, dry forest in the south, this amazing spiny forest. It's been an island for the last 88 million years.
What was it before it was an island?
It was a little inconsequential wedge of land inside Gondwana, floating around.
Which was this giant continent.
Inside this super continent, floating around across the face of the globe. And then 88 million years ago, it becomes an island, and it has this wonderful sort of Dr. Seuss kind of fauna of 7 species of dinosaurs that flew, a giant dinosaur-eating frog, vegetarian crocodiles. I mean, you couldn't make it up. Then 66 million years ago, an asteroid hits the Earth and 75% of land animals disappear globally, and everything disappears from Madagascar except for the 2 species have descendants. There are 2 species alive today whose ancestors lived before the asteroid. So now you're this big island off 400 kilometers off the coast of Africa. So how do you repopulate yourself? And the answer to that question is a big piece of sort of the answer to your question is what's so distinctive about Madagascar? Well, a few critters made it across, and then they evolved, and Madagascar kind of improvised with what nature provided.
What were the 2 species that survived from
One was a side-necked turtle, and the other is a kind of lizard. Anyway, nothing very exciting. Well, to me, nothing very exciting or dramatic.
Then the flora and fauna does become exciting because, the other thing about an island ecology is that it has strange effects, doesn't it? You get kind of very large examples of things that are normally small, very small examples of things that are normally large. Why does that happen in island evolution?
So what happened? So for birds could fly across, and many did, but it's interesting that there are no woodpeckers in Madagascar, there are no honey guides, there are no hornbills, there are birds that should be there and aren't, and so that raises sort of interesting questions.
And is there any theory as to why that is?
Well, yes, but we don't have time to talk about it.
I think it's just chance. Who gets there?
I think there is good empirical evidence that Madagascar is an exceedingly unpredictable environment which presents real challenges for everybody who lives there. And it's my surmise, guess, because there's no evidence for this yet, that it's acted as a second filter for some species of birds, and they didn't adapt to this unpredictability.
Now, you study an animal unique to Madagascar, which is the lemur, and particularly the Sifaka lemur, I think. They evolved presumably from an arrival from overseas.
Well, they're the ancestors of all the lemurs, and there are now said to be 107 species. That's because, back to your question, Tim, about sort of what constitutes a species. Anyway, they used to be considered to be fewer. Now there are considered to be 107. They all descended from a single arrival on a mat of vegetation floating out of the mouth of the Zambezi River between 55 and 52 million years ago. Of course, that's not what really happened. Is one day or one night, this poor bedraggled little group of half-starved, a pregnant female or a female and a male, there has to have been one or the other, or they couldn't reproduce, and they kind of stagger up the beach and somehow make it. And then over the next 55 million years, they evolve and diversify and occupy, there is a lemur that has a kind of woodpecker-like habit. So they evolve into niches that are occupied by other kinds of animals in other places.
And they've evolved in very interesting ways socially as well. The Sifaka lemur is a matriarchal society.
Yes.
In which
yes. I suppose you could say that. Females are so... This is what first got me sort of into Madagascar, is that I'm interested in the evolution of social systems. Why be social? Warm-blooded, furry animals, 2/3 of the species of mammals in the world live solitary lives. So you have to ask, why be social? And then what are the rules of social organization? Well, a good way of understanding the rules is to understand the rule breakers. And the lemurs break the rules. And one of the ways they break the rules is that females and males are the same size. In most other mammals, males are bigger than females. And females can stare down or just cuff a male and he'll get out of her way. They're socially dominant to males.
And is there any theory as to why that has evolved? What's the idea about why that has evolved?
Well, I mean, that was what I, with great hubris, went to Madagascar to figure out.
How many years ago?
And of course, the answer is not simple. And it probably has to do, again, back to particular environmental challenges that confront these animals, not just lemurs, in fact, and the particular reproductive, the burdens of the energy costs of reproduction and the uncertainty of reproduction, and it makes it worth a female's while to face down a male. But the alternative, there is an alternative explanation, which is that there are many solutions.
We have no time for it, I'm afraid. People are going to have to read your book or something else to find it. Thank you to all of my guests. Tim Birkhead's Birds and Us is out now, and Alison Richards' The Sleuth Lemur's Song is published at the end of the month. Audubon's Birds of America, curated by Mark Lancy, is at the National Museum of Scotland until May. Many thanks to today's studio engineer, Sue Mayo. Next week, Adam Rutherford puts Welshness under the spotlight. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thanks for listening to this edition of Start the Week on BBC Radio 4, produced by Katie Hickman. And if you're after more conversations on art, science, history and politics, you can find many, many more on the BBC Sounds website.